The champagne toast hadn't even finished when I realized my husband's business partner of 11 years was about to publicly announce that he was buying him out. In front of 200 guests, at our own company's 10th anniversary celebration, without my husband knowing a single word of it in advance. I was standing near the bar, holding a glass I hadn't touched, watching this man, Greg Sutton, who had stood beside my husband at our wedding, who had held our daughter the week she was born, who I had genuinely foolishly considered family for over a decade. Step up to a small stage with a microphone and a printed announcement folded neatly in his jacket pocket. What Greg didn't know, standing there adjusting his tie with the calm confidence of a man who believed he'd already won, was that the forensic accountant I'd quietly hired 6 weeks earlier had finished her report that very morning. And that a junior bookkeeper, sitting at table 12, terrified but resolute, had already decided she was done staying silent. Before I tell you exactly what happened on that stage, tell me, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? I genuinely read every single comment, and it means more than you'd think to see how far this reaches. I also want to be upfront before we go any further. This is a work of fiction, written for entertainment. The names, the people, the events. None of it is real, and any resemblance to anyone living is entirely coincidental. My name is Diane Foster. I'm 36 years old, and for 14 years, I've been married to a man named Mark. Quiet, principled, the kind of person who still handwrites thank you notes to vendors, even after building a company that by last year employed 63 people and generated just under $9 million in annual revenue. Mark started that company, a specialty industrial parts distributor, 11 years ago in our garage with a single laptop and a list of contacts from his previous job. 18 months in, when the workload had become unmanageable for one person, he brought in Greg Sutton, a former college roommate, someone Mark had known and trusted since they were 19 years old, sharing a cramped dorm room and, according to the story Mark told at our wedding, exactly one functioning mini fridge between them. Greg became, officially, a 40% partner. Mark kept 60%, since the original idea, the original client relationships, and the initial capital had all come from him. It was, by every measure anyone outside the company ever saw, a genuine functional partnership. Two friends who trusted each other enough to build something together and split the rewards fairly. I trusted Greg too. For most of those 11 years, I had no reason to. The first sign something had shifted came roughly 18 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as a sign at the time. Only in hindsight, once I understood what I was actually looking at. Mark mentioned, almost in passing one evening, that Greg had started handling more of the company's banking relationships personally. Meeting directly with their commercial lender, managing the line of credit renewals, the kind of administrative responsibility that had previously been split evenly between them. He says it's just easier with one point of contact for the bank. Mark told me, shrugging slightly. Makes sense. I've got enough on my plate with the client side anyway. I didn't think much of it. Mark trusted Greg completely, the way you trust someone you've known for over 20 years, and questioning that trust at the time would have felt almost insulting to suggest. What I didn't know, what neither of us knew for almost a year, was that Greg had used that expanded banking access to begin quietly restructuring the company's debt obligations in ways that, on paper, looked like routine financial management, but that were, in actual substance, slowly shifting the company's liability structure to make Mark's 60% ownership stake considerably less valuable than it appeared, while increasing the leverage Greg personally held over the business's ongoing operations. The second sign came 8 months ago, when our daughter's elementary school called asking about a tuition assistance application Mark had apparently never submitted, despite Mark mentioning, weeks earlier, that he'd specifically set aside funds from his year-end bonus distribution for exactly that purpose. When Mark checked, he discovered his bonus distribution, a fixed 60% share of the company's annual profit pool, the same formula they'd used since the partnership began, had come in nearly 30% lower than the previous year, despite the company's revenue actually increasing. Greg explained it, smoothly, as the result of reinvestment decisions he'd made on behalf of the company. New equipment purchases, an expanded warehouse lease. Decisions Greg said he'd made unilaterally specifically because Mark had been swamped with client work and Greg didn't want to bother him with every operational detail. Mark, trusting, exhausted, genuinely grateful to have a partner handling details he didn't have time for, accepted the explanation without pushing further. I did not accept it nearly as easily. I should explain something about my own background, because it matters for what happened next. Before staying home to raise our daughter, I spent 6 years working as a corporate auditor for a regional accounting firm. specifically specializing in identifying exactly the kind of subtle, slow-moving financial restructuring that, on the surface, looks like reasonable business management, but that, examined carefully, reveals a clear pattern of value extraction. I had stepped away from that career by choice when our daughter was born, but I hadn't forgotten how to read a balance sheet or how to recognize the specific shape of a partner quietly engineering themselves into a stronger position at someone else's expense. 6 weeks before our company's 10th anniversary party, I asked Mark casually if I could look through the company's financial statements for the past 2 years, framing it, honestly, as simple curiosity, wanting to understand the business better. What I found, within the first evening of reviewing those documents, made my hands go cold in a way I hadn't felt since my auditing days, back when I'd occasionally uncovered something that I knew immediately was going to end someone's career. Greg had restructured nearly $4 million of the company's secured debt over the previous 14 months, consolidating it under a new lending arrangement that included a clause, buried on page 11 of a 43-page credit agreement, granting the lender expanded rights to call the loan due immediately under a broader, more easily triggered set of material adverse change conditions than the company's original financing had ever included. More specifically, and more troublingly, the new agreement's definition of key person risk had been quietly rewritten to include language suggesting the loan could be called due if Mark's day-to-day operational involvement in the company decreased below a certain threshold. A threshold Greg himself had unilaterally negotiated, and a clause that, I would later learn, gave Greg significant leverage to argue, internally, that Mark's role should be restructured for the company's financial protection. In plain terms, Greg had quietly built a financial mechanism that made it considerably easier to argue, eventually, that Mark needed to step back from active operations. A step back that would, conveniently, position Greg as the company's primary operational leader, regardless of the actual 60-40 ownership split on paper. I did not tell Mark immediately. I wanted first to understand exactly how deep this went, and I wanted documentation thorough enough that there would be no room for Greg to explain it away with another smooth, plausible justification. I hired a forensic accountant. Her name was Rebecca Chu, meticulous, soft-spoken woman recommended by a former colleague from my auditing days, someone whose entire professional reputation was built on her ability to trace exactly where money moved and exactly why across complex business structures. I gave her 6 weeks and full access to every financial document I could legally obtain as the spouse of a 60% owner. I told her specifically that I wasn't looking for her to find wrongdoing. I told her, honestly, that I genuinely hoped she'd find nothing, that I hoped this was simply my own auditor's instincts overreacting to ordinary business decisions. She did find nothing. Rebecca's report, which she finished compiling the morning of our anniversary party, traced a clear, documented pattern across nearly 2 years. The restructured debt agreement, the unilateral reinvestment decisions that had quietly suppressed Mark's profit distributions while increasing operational expenses, routed through vendors that, upon closer inspection, shared an address with a consulting LLC registered under Greg's brother-in-law's name, and a pattern of internal memos. Recovered through standard company email archives Rebecca was legally authorized to review, in which Greg had, on at least 6 separate occasions over the previous year, referred to Mark, in writing to other senior staff, as someone who doesn't need to be looped in on this level of detail anymore. The report was 31 pages long. It was specific, sourced, and entirely unambiguous about what it documented. I had planned to show it to Mark privately, calmly, the week after the anniversary party, once the celebration itself was behind us. Greg's own timeline turned out to be considerably faster than mine. I learned only 2 days before the party, from a nervous, visibly anxious phone call from a junior bookkeeper named Priya Anand, that Greg intended to use the anniversary celebration itself as a stage for something considerably more aggressive than I'd anticipated. Priya had worked at the company for just under 2 years, handling routine accounts payable processing, a position with limited authority, but as it turned out, just enough visibility into internal communications to notice something that deeply troubled her. She told me, her voice shaking slightly over the phone, that she'd overheard Greg on a call the previous week with an outside investor, discussing what Greg referred to as the transition, and mentioning, specifically, that he intended to make a public announcement at the anniversary event, while everyone's already gathered, so the narrative gets framed the way I want it framed before Mark has time to push back in private.
Greg, it turned out, had quietly lined up a minority investor willing to provide the capital for a forced buyout of Mark's ownership stake. Using as leverage the very debt restructuring clause Rebecca had already identified in her report, the one suggesting the company's financial stability required more consistent, hands-on operational leadership than Mark, according to Greg's planned framing, had apparently been providing. Priya told me she decided, after weeks of anxious deliberation, that she couldn't stay silent and watch it happen without at least telling someone. I asked her if she'd be willing to say, on the record, in front of others if necessary, exactly what she'd overheard. She said yes. The anniversary party itself was held at a restored event space downtown. String lights, a small stage, 200 guests including employees, clients, vendors, and several local business association members. Mark had cultivated relationships with over a decade of careful, consistent work. Mark gave a brief, genuinely heartfelt opening speech, thanking employees by name, thanking clients for their loyalty, thanking, with visible emotion, his partner and friend of over 20 years, Greg Sutton, without whom none of this would have been possible. Greg smiled warmly throughout that toast, raised his glass, and said nothing that suggested, to anyone in that room, that he was roughly 20 minutes away from attempting to take that entire company away from the man standing beside him. I stood near the bar, Rebecca's 31-page report in a folder inside my purse, Priya seated quietly at table 12, and I waited. Greg took the stage roughly 40 minutes into the event, requesting the microphone from the event coordinator with smooth, practiced confidence of a man who had clearly rehearsed exactly what he was about to say. I want to take a moment. Greg began, smiling at the room, to talk a little bit about where this company is headed next. 10 years is an incredible milestone, and I think it's the perfect moment to talk honestly about growth, and about leadership, and about making sure this business is positioned for the next 10 years just as strongly as it's been positioned for the last 10. He glanced, briefly, toward Mark, who was standing near the front of the room, smiling, completely unaware of what was about to happen. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Greg continued, about operational structure, about what this company needs to scale sustainably. And I'm excited to share that we've secured a new investment partnership that's going to allow some exciting transitions in how. Greg? My own voice surprised me slightly, the way it cut cleanly through the room before I'd fully decided to use it. He looked toward me, his expression flickering, just briefly, with something that hadn't been there a moment earlier. I think before you finish that sentence, I said, walking calmly toward the small stage, Rebecca's folder now in my hand. Everyone in this room deserves to actually understand what new investment partnership means. Because I don't think it means what you're about to imply it means. What followed over the next several minutes was not loud.
I want to be clear about that because I think people imagine confrontations like this as shouting matches, and this was almost the opposite. I spoke calmly, methodically, the way Rebecca's report itself was written. Specific, sourced, unambiguous. I described the restructured debt agreement. The key person risk clause Greg had quietly negotiated, the suppressed profit distributions, the vendor payments routed through a consulting LLC connected to Greg's own brother-in-law. I asked Priya, gently, if she would be willing to share what she'd overheard. She stood up from table 12, her voice shaking slightly but clear, and repeated, almost word for word, the conversation she'd described to me on the phone 2 days earlier. Greg's plan to frame the narrative before Mark had any opportunity to respond privately. Mark stood near the front of that room, listening, his face shifting through something I had genuinely never seen on him before in 14 years of marriage. Confusion, then disbelief, then something quieter and considerably colder, the specific expression of a person watching, in real time, exactly how thoroughly they'd been deceived by someone they'd trusted since they were 19 years old. Greg attempted, several times, to interject, calling the accusations a misunderstanding, insisting the debt restructuring had been standard business practice, suggesting Rebecca's report was being selectively interpreted. But the room had already shifted. I watched several board members and senior employees exchange quiet, uncomfortable glances. I watched the outside investor Greg had apparently lined up. A man I didn't recognize, standing near the back of the room, his expression growing visibly more uncomfortable with each passing minute. Quietly check his phone and step toward the exit. Mark didn't raise his voice either. That, I think, surprised Greg more than anything else that happened that night. I'd like everyone to enjoy the rest of the evening, Mark said, taking the microphone calmly from Greg's hand. This isn't the venue for resolving a business dispute, and I apologize to all of you for the disruption. Greg and I will be having a much longer, Much more private conversation starting tomorrow morning with our respective attorneys present. He turned to Greg directly, his voice dropping, quiet enough that only those of us standing closest to the stage could hear it clearly. 20 years, Greg, he said. I want you to think very carefully tonight about whether what you were about to do up here was actually worth that. The legal process that followed took nearly 7 months. Rebecca's forensic report, combined with the internal email pattern she'd documented and Priya's formal written statement, gave Mark's attorney more than enough grounds to pursue a full buyout of Greg's ownership stake under the partnership's existing breach of fiduciary duty provisions. A clause, it turned out, that Greg himself had insisted on including in their original partnership agreement 11 years earlier, back when he'd been the one worried about Mark potentially mismanaging the business someday. Greg ultimately agreed to a settlement rather than risk a public trial that would have made every detail of Rebecca's report part of the permanent legal record. He sold his 40% stake back to Mark at a valuation considerably below what he would have received under normal circumstances, and he stepped away from the company entirely effective immediately. He has not spoken to Mark since. I understand, through mutual acquaintances, that he has since taken a director-level position at a competing distributor 2 states away. Mark runs the company alone now, sole owner for the first time in 11 years. He hired a new chief financial officer within 2 months. Someone with absolutely no personal history with either of us, specifically because Mark, understandably, never wants to feel that particular kind of blindness again. Priya, for her part, was promoted to senior accounts manager 6 months after the party, a decision Mark made entirely independently. Simply because, as he told her directly, you were the only person in this building brave enough to tell me the truth when it actually mattered. I think often about that 31-page report sitting quietly in my purse while Greg stood on that stage, smiling, completely confident that the narrative was already his to control. I think about how close it came. How easily, if I hadn't trusted my own instincts 6 weeks earlier, if Priya hadn't found the courage to make that frightened phone call, Greg might have stood on that exact stage and simply taken, smoothly, publicly, with everyone watching, something that had taken my husband 11 years to build. He didn't know I was already holding the proof. He just assumed, the way people like Greg always assume, that the quiet wife standing near the bar wasn't paying close enough attention to notice. He was wrong. Do you think Mark should have pursued a full lawsuit instead of accepting a settlement? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, subscribe to the Family Ledger for a brand new story every day.